Hello, welcome Biblical History or Bible as History students. I have one group that is doing this for religious studies credit, another group who's doing it for history's credit, and then a third group who's doing it for a graduate history's credit. I want to make a little video for you, especially for these first few chapters, and tell you a little bit about how the course is planned out. And kind of help you at least get into Ian Proven's book to start out with. Yeah. Okay. Now, as you know, you have a first assignment that's due on the 9th. Hopefully you have your books and you're able to do it. And if you've already started reading this first chapter, your head might be spinning because, as I said in that video that I sent you via email last week, I've warned you that these first 5 chapters are very tough. And so I don't want to leave you out in the cold, in this deep end of the pool, just flailing away. I do want to give you a little bit of kind of talk through a little bit about what you're reading. So if you know what you're reading, you'll be able to understand what you're reading a little more. All right? So let me just take a few minutes, maybe 10, 15 minutes, to kind of tell you big picture what Ian Proven... Sorry, my nose is itching. I hope that doesn't bother you. What Ian Proven is arguing in these first 5 chapters, particularly chapter 1 right here. Starting in chapter 6 is when we actually get into the biblical story, starting with Abraham, and get into the historical questions and whatnot. These first 5 chapters really are a long, drawn-out scholarly argument about the nature of how do you assess historical text, biblical text, how do you do history, how does that relate to archaeology, a lot of issues that scholars deal with that most people don't. But if you want to understand the historical challenges to reading the Old and New Testament, these are some fundamental issues you need to know. So at the most bottom basic level, the issue that Proven is dealing with is when it comes to the Old Testament, primarily starting from Abraham all the way through the exile, these texts, are they really about actual history? Are they just made up fictional stories? How can you tell that they're history? How does the archaeological finds that we've had over the last century, how do they stack up to what we read? Is it all historical? Is it all fiction? Is parts of it historical? Is parts of it fiction? How do you assess these Old Testament texts? Because at the very least, if you've ever tried to read the Old Testament, it clearly seems to be purporting to be about historical people and events. So how historically reliable is the Old Testament? And again, to make it oversimplified, but at the beginning you kind of need that, there are 2 extreme camps when it comes to assessing the biblical text. On one side, we will call the maximalist camp. And you could probably guess what they think. They tend to think that everything you read in the Old Testament is just like newspaper documentary reporting. It happened just like that. When they read the story of the Exodus and the Hebrews going through the Red Sea, they have visions of Charlton Heston in the 10 Commandments. It literally happened just like that. Okay, they read everything as a newspaper account, straightforward facts. You just got to believe it. That's the maximalist camp. That's a little extreme. On the other side, you have the minimalist camp, and this is the group that Proven is going to be challenging throughout his book. He's not a maximalist, as hopefully it'll be obvious. But he's taken issue with the minimalist camp because this is the in vogue view by a lot of scholars today. And the minimalist camp basically says nothing you read in the Old Testament is historically reliable. It's probably a lot of fiction. It's probably just made up. We have no way of knowing. We just it's not really history. Okay? Proven has a big problem with that because that's too far the other extreme. So in these first 5 chapters, what he's going to do, by taking on that view, he's going to be discussing what he feels is the proper way to read and assess these Old Testament historical texts, and just how to wrestle with them, okay? Now, so there's a number of fundamental questions he's going to be addressing. How do you assess ancient writing? One of the things you'll realize if you've tried to read through the Old Testament is it's not written like a textbook. It's written in the form of stories. You know, the Abraham stories from chapter Genesis 12 to 25, 26. There's a story to it. There's a narrative arc to it. There's things going on. It's written as a story, as is everything in the Old Testament. Whether it's Joshua, Judges, the story of David. They purport to be history, but they're written as stories. And so one of the fundamental questions that scholars ask is, if there is creativeness in the storytelling, does that diminish or negate any historical claims? That's one question that Proven is going to answer. And he's going to basically say, no, that doesn't diminish historical claims. A good example would be if you've seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge, about the World War II movie. That movie is about history, but by making of the movie, Mel Gibson, the director, has taken the history and creatively shaped it into a specific narrative to convey that story. Just because he's using creative directorial decisions to fit the history into the narrative, that doesn't negate that the history wasn't really happening. Okay, it's not fiction. Hacksaw Ridge is not fiction. It's history, but it's told in a creative way. And essentially, Proven is going to be saying that's what's going on in a lot of these Old Testament books. Another question is the fact that a lot of these writings in the Old Testament were written at a much later date than the events. For example, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Samuel, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, were all written during the exile, and that's like the 6th century BCE. But a lot of those events they're writing about happened hundreds of years before. Does the fact that they're written at a later date mean they can't be historically reliable? He's going to address that issue. He says not necessarily, because there's a certain oral tradition. The book of Judges was written down in its final form in the exile, but that doesn't mean those stories were made up in the exile. They were probably taken from earlier sources, oral sources, that were there throughout their history. So just because they were composed in the final form at a certain time doesn't automatically mean they're not historical. And the fourth question that you have to wrestle with is, if a text is ideological in nature, if it has an agenda, does that mean it can't be historical? And if you know anything about ancient writing, whether it's biblical or Assyrian or Babylonian, that's simply not true. Any kind of ancient writing that's talking about the greatness of Nebuchadnezzar or the greatness of Sennacherib, they're going to be telling about historical events, but they're telling it in a way to make those kings look really good. So they have an agenda to the writing, but that doesn't mean they're fiction. Okay? That's kind of the things that Proven is going to be addressing in these first 5 chapters. How do you assess these ancient documents? Does their creativity negate automatically the historical claims? Does the ideology in the text automatically dismiss the historical claims? How do you figure out that stuff? And it's a tricky question. But because it's a tricky, complicated question, it's best to avoid both extreme camps of minimalist and maximalist. Now, what you're going to see here in the first chapter is he takes issue with a number of specific scholars. Now, you have to read it carefully because this is heavy academic stuff. He takes an issue with the scholars, I think Keith Whitlam, Andrew Saugin, Miller, and Hayes, and he talks about how they present the history. Basically, Whitlam says none of it is historical, and Proven is going to explain why he has a problem with that view. Saugin basically says once you get to King David from then on, that stuff is probably historical, but the Exodus, Joshua, Judges stuff, that's not historical. He'll say why Saugin makes that claim, and then Proven is going to explain why he thinks that's faulty. And then Miller and Hayes says that they think the book of Judges has historical stuff to it, but not the Joshua stuff and the Exodus, not so much. He's going to talk about that. So he's discussing various scholars' views on what's historical and what's not in the Old Testament, and he's picking them apart and saying why their reasoning falls flat ultimately. Okay. He then, in the second part of the chapter, he talks about the very fundamental way we go about understanding history. And you don't realize this, but you will, how everything changed with the 17th century, 18th century Enlightenment. Before the Enlightenment, history was considered to be, and he gives the quote at some point, history was philosophy teaching by examples. So before the Enlightenment, when people wrote about history, they were writing it to try to teach philosophical ideas and concepts and views. They weren't trying to be objective historians. They were writing about history, but they were shaping the history to teach a lesson. With the coming of the Enlightenment, though, there was what he calls a modern shift. And the idea was we're going to just talk about the facts to show that how we're ever progressing better. And that's why you even have the very concepts of the way we now label things in history. We have the Enlightenment. Before that, we had the Dark Ages. Because the Dark Ages happened before the scientific revolution, so they're all stupid idiots. Well, as soon as you say that, you're kind of imposing your own agenda on how you do history in the first place. And there was a major shift during the Enlightenment, but what Proven is going to be getting at is the way you do history reveals some philosophical presuppositions you have yourself as to how you go about doing history, and you have to be acknowledging that. So one of the things modern biblical studies in modernity in general was really about is that German phrase. I'm not going to say the German phrase because I don't know German, but the way it really was. And you're going to find that in the chapter at one point. Basically what that meant is that a lot of early modern scholars, when they came to the Old Testament and they would read 1 Samuel, they would view the text as kind of like a curtain that prevented them from getting back to the true history because the text had an agenda, and so you can't really trust the text. So they would try to find what they would call scientific ways to kind of get around the text to find out how it really was. So, you get in 2 Samuel, the story of David and Bathsheba. You get the story in 2 Samuel 13. The scholar would go, okay, that's what the story says, but what really happened? They have an immediate hyper-skepticism of the text, and then they would try to look for clues in the text that might tell them what really happened. They viewed the text as a curtain that prevented them from seeing the past. Proven is going to argue that text is like a smudgy window, but that's the only way you can get to the past. You can't get around the text. Now, the text might have certain creativity to it, there might be certain agendas to it, but the only way you can even get to the past is to look through the text. That's the window. So, is the text a window to the past, or is it a curtain that prevents viewing of the past? And he's going to argue that the text is the only way we can get to the past. There's issues to deal with, but you can't. If you view the text as the curtain, basically everything you say about the past, it's speculative. And that's the problem. Okay, so by the end of chapter 1, that's what he's going to be getting at. It's from what he sees in a lot of modern biblical Old Testament biblical scholarship, is there's kind of a hyper-skepticism of the text, what he calls tradition. That's what you're reading in the text is the tradition, the traditional story. And too many modern scholars, as he has shown in the chapter, they say you can't trust the text. Here's where I think the real history began. But the problem is, if you don't trust the text to try to get to some objective understanding of history, every scholar has a different view. And so this attempt to scientifically get behind the text to get to the real history, it's failed because no scholars agree. Okay? So, at the very, very, very end of the chapter, this is the question 14 for your homework assignment, is as Proven tries to articulate what he feels are the fundamental questions we have to address when we come to assessing these ancient biblical texts. All right. Hopefully that made some sense. Now, like I said in my first video, this first chapter is going to be a bear, as the second one will be. But if you keep those things I just said in mind, that's kind of where he's going, what he's arguing. As you work your way through these first 5 chapters, through a lot of this scholarly theory and argument, by the time you get to chapter 5, hopefully you'll have a pretty good layout of the issues. So when we do get into the biblical stories and the text, you'll be in a better position to assess what Proven says about them and, everything else we do in the course. So hopefully that helps. All right, so I'll try to make a video for chapter 2 in a few days, and we'll just keep plowing through, and hopefully you'll enjoy the class.